there needs to be a program, a viable program in this country that provides support to unemployed workers, to their families, and to communities. There was such a fund. There was such a fund until the Liberals got their hands on it back in the mid-90s, Mr. Speaker. At that point, 80% of unemployed Canadians had access to this fund. By the time the Liberals got through with it, that had been reduced to 45%, Mr. Speaker. And now, since the Conservatives have had their go at it, it's reduced now to nearly 36–37% of unemployed Canadians actually have an opportunity to access these funds. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because that's really the heart of why it is that we're dealing with this motion today, is to not only protect the fund, and I'll explain why that's important, but to make sure that the account is set up in a way that it truly does the work that's necessary, that it in fact does what it is that the employment insurance was originally established for, and that is to provide support for unemployed workers, to provide support for parents on paternity leave, Mr. Speaker, to provide sick benefits, and heaven forbid, even to provide training for people to bridge that opportunity or that period between jobs. But let me talk for a second about why access has come to be such a problem. Under the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, as I indicated earlier, before the Liberals got at this account, 80% of unemployed workers had access to it. Under their reforms, EI access fell, as I indicated, below 50%. The Conservatives saw an opportunity, and they have continued to reduce access. As recently as 2012, they brought in some major changes that had particularly affected seasonal industries in my part of the world, in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker, that made it particularly difficult in a number of different industries that depended on shorter-term seasonal work. It made it increasingly difficult. So to the point where in July of 2013, the fund reached, eligibility reached 36.5. It's up a bit now, getting a little closer to 40, but that's one reason for that, Mr. Speaker, is because of the high level of unemployment in this country. Only 60% of new mothers receive maternity benefits, mostly because they have insufficient hours under these Conservative changes. On top of those eligibility issues, we've got a further problem in, or I should say unemployed workers have a further problem, and their employers, and that is with Service Canada, Mr. Speaker. The 25% of applicants for EI are waiting above the supposed service standard of 28 days. It's now in excess of 40 days. And I must say, we raised this issue last fall. We actually have raised it for the past 2 years, but particularly last fall, the minister responsible stood in his place and talked about how his parliamentary secretary had done a study on this work and had made some changes. We asked him to table the study to show us what the results were, and all of a sudden that study wasn't good enough to be released. We still haven't seen it, Mr. Speaker. What we do know is that people seeking unemployment insurance benefits are still having to wait over 40 days. So as I indicated, the government made changes in 2012, a number of changes in terms of eligibility for benefits, but one of the particular issues was around the Social Security Tribunal, Mr. Speaker. There used to be, around EI, there used to be an appeal process where it was a tripartite process where you had the worker had a representative at the appeal, the employer had a representative at the appeal, and there was an independent chairperson that was there at the appeal. In other words, there was due process. There was justice. The worker could expect that they had an opportunity to have their case heard. That's been completely revamped, that process, Mr. Speaker, to now where there's an official within the department that looks at this themselves. They don't share information, and a lot of it is done behind closed doors. But the worst thing of all is that at the end of 2014, there was a backlog of 11,000 cases, Mr. Speaker. So not only was the process turned upside down and workers were no longer had access to due process, but now the process isn't even going forward. So these appeals aren't being heard of, Mr. Speaker. The other point that I wanted to make was the fact that the fund, and my colleague François Rivière said that we were tabling a bill in this, we had tabled a bill in this House to protect the EI fund. Well, why are we doing that? Why do we have to protect the sanctity of that fund? Well, I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker. Because the Liberals took $54 billion in the EI fund and they used it for other purposes. So in other words, the money that was put into that fund by workers and by employers to provide employment insurance when workers lost their jobs through no fault of their own, Mr. Speaker, that was appropriated to other places. And then the Conservatives came along and they thought, well, that's pretty neat, have access to this fund. Why don't we try that too, Mr. Speaker? And they went ahead and they had their way with over $3 billion in that fund, all the while, of course, not changing premiums. So now we have a situation where there's less money in the fund, and even so, now this government is proposing to reduce premiums next year, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? If we even left the premiums at their current level, we could provide EI benefits to another 130,000 unemployed workers. We think that makes a whole lot of sense. My point is that the EI fund should be managed independently. Decisions about premiums should be independent of government. They should not be influenced by the political whim of the government of the day. We've seen the damage that can be done by that as a result of what the Liberals and Conservatives have done, Mr. Speaker. It's wrong, and that's why we are proposing in this motion and have talked with Canadians about how, under an NDP government, we will certainly make those changes. I want to, for a second, I want to go back, Mr. Speaker, to what it is that we want. We want to ensure that more Canadians and middle-class families have access to the support they need if they lose their jobs, need to take parental leave or become ill, or need to care for loved ones under the compassionate care leave program, Mr. Speaker, that was extended in this budget to 6 months, which we support. We push for that. But the eligibility problems are still the same thing, that very few people are accessible, that people caring for ALS patients, Mr. Speaker, are unable to have access to that fund. The NDP wants to make sure the premiums that workers and employers pay into the fund are actually used to provide EI benefits to the unemployed, special benefits for families, and training for Canadians. That's why I had the pleasure of tabling Bill C-605 in order to put a fence around that fund. And we want to, Mr. Speaker, make sure that Canadian workers and businesses are involved in creating an EI fund that actually works for them. When this government made the changes in 2012, those 5 massive changes, they did so without any consultation with the Atlantic provinces or with Quebec or with any other provinces whatsoever. It had a very, detrimental impact, and the provinces said so to this government. We are committed to working with the provinces, to working with workers and their representatives, and to working with employers to make sure that we have an EI fund that is protected, that is independent, and actually supports working people.
Bravo. Bravo.